area, Siyun and all these areas. Now, one of these scholars is by the name of Abu Bakr, Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr, if I'm not mistaken, around the end of 5th century, around about 600 something Hijri, 600 something, Hijri. He travels. This guy is a celebrated faqih, celebrated hadith scholar, celebrated in tasawwuf and ilm and everything, but he is what we call in when it comes to giving people names, 𝗏𝙲𝙜𝙑𝙑, like Shafi'ism is like in his bones and in his bone marrow. He's well studied by that. He basically leaves Yemen, which is at that time also a huge center for Shafi'i fiqh. It's all the books that we have in that time period is either from Yemen or either from Persia, no doubt from that. So he leaves that place and he wants to go to Mogadishu. And he says, in the biographical layers, we have that anecdote. He says, I want to go to Mogadishu because I've heard that a couple of scholars have actually went there and they studied the Wasit, which is by Imam al-Ghazali. So Imam Ghazali by then has died 60 years before him, before this story kicks off, around 60, 70 years before that. So Imam Ghazali's Wasit, Imam Shirazi's Muhaddab, and Imam Shirazi's Tanbih, they have studied these 3 books in a year. So Wasit and Basit, if any your listeners who are Shafi'i students of knowledge or ulama even know the multi-volume works, they are like the end of it all. This is like not a book you just pick up to study. But he's saying people actually go to Mogadishu to study those books, those 4 books, so 4 major, what Imam Nawawi calls the 5 pinnacle books in our madhab, Imam Nawawi calls it. So he wants to go and study that in Mogadishu in 1 year. Is that possible? That's what he's wondering. And that's what the anecdote of the biographical layers are telling us. Is that possible? Can such a thing, can such a feat be done? And so he says, I'm going to put that to the test and I want to go and study in Mogadishu. And what do you know? He comes to Mogadishu, he finds a scholar celebrated for actually teaching all 4 books. And he indeed studies with him in a year. Indeed goes back in Yemen saying like, I've completed that task. And this is one of those phenomenal stories that you have. And that is just one, but one of the most phenomenal stories in that time period of Sa'id Mogadishu that he lived.
Fascinating stuff. And you mentioned Mogadishu being a trade hub or a place of significance politically, strategically, and culturally. Tell us a bit about Mogadishu, because we hear a lot about figures such as Sa'id of Mogadishu, and he's captivated the attention of many people because of his legendary journeys into the East and other parts of the world, oftentimes characterized as being the first African ambassador in the Far East. Tell us a bit about him and his career, his trajectory.
To his ambassadorship role in a minute, inshallah. But the importance of Mogadishu and places like Mogadishu, it's not only Mogadishu, 𝗖𝙗𝗓 was one of those as well. There's many cities and city-states that actually dwindled down and do not exist, unfortunately, anymore. That we would see again once more in the biographical layers, because such and such came from such and such place, but these places do not exist now anymore. But the importance of these places like Mogadishu becomes really ingrained in people, especially in an article that I wrote, 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, because the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 here in essence means that in many times the Muslim powerhouses located in Persia, which is Shiraz, basically Transoxania area, 𝗲 وراء which is known in our literature, in our Muslim literature, 𝗲 وراء where the Persians ruled, the Burji dynasty ruled, where the Fatimid ruled in Cairo, where Allah Musta'an, the Abbasid ruled in Baghdad. All these hubs where actually powerhouses existed that vied for the positions of Khalif, and they always clash with one another. The consequence has always been that the ulama, the rich people, the people with name, people with reputation, however do not want to be caught up with political strife, one of the first places that ended up going was to Mogadishu. One of the first places that they were migrating was, from hopping. Like we have a scholar by the name of 𝗾𝙗𝗓, for example, who lived around the 5th century Hijra, very famous scholar. He left basically Shiraz. Shiraz is at that time the height of Islamic civilization. The madarises are built everywhere. Imam Ghazali and Juwayni, they lived there. Their outpouring and the things that they've produced in terms of knowledge for us today that we have. So these person like him runs away, comes to Yemen, and you would think, oh, Yemen is, there's Islamic center, stay there, teach there, get a position there, develop, But he just stays there, but he doesn't want to stay in Yemen or Aden or Zabit or all these places that he went to, despite the leaders in Yemen at the time, who were the Banu Mahd, asking them to stay, we give you position, we give you wealth and stuff because of his reputation. But no, he wants to go to Zayla, he wants to go to Mogadishu, and he eventually hops up on a bit. Unfortunately, he doesn't arrive because he dies through the shipwrecking, right? And so we have series of names like this consistently, that people who actually leave Yemen, people who leave Persia, people who leave the Hijaz, people who leave Syria, that actually cross all these places and they want to settle in Mogadishu, they want to settle in places like this. And there's a long list of names that I could actually name and the effect that I've had. But coming back to the time period of Said of Mogadishu, we have several scholars, again, coming from different parts of that world that we just talked about, that want to specifically stay in Mogadishu, that they want to study, teach. One famous scholar by the name of 𝗲𝗲 𝗲𝗲𝗓, its name was 𝗲𝗲. He was a Ba'alawi from the Yemeni Hadramaut area, and he was one of the early ones of the Ba'alawi qabil, or that actually exists now in Hadramaut, Tarim area, Sayoun, and all these areas. Now, one of these scholars is by the name of Abu Bakr, Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr, if I'm not mistaken. Around the end of 5th century, around about 600 something Hijri, 600 something, Hijri. He travels. This guy is a celebrated faqih, celebrated hadith scholar, celebrated in tasawwuf and ilm and everything, but he is what we call in when it comes to giving people names, 𝗏𝙗𝗚𝗏𝗏, like Shafi'ism is like in his bones and in his bone marrow. It's well studied by that. He basically leaves Yemen, which is at that time also a huge center for Shafi'i fiqh. It's all the books that we have in that time period is either from Yemen or either from Persia, no doubt from that. So he leaves that place and he wants to go to Mogadishu. And he says, in the biographical layers, we have that anecdote. He says, I want to go to Mogadishu because I've heard that a couple of scholars have actually went there and they studied the Wasit, which is by Imam al-Ghazali. So Imam Ghazali by then has died 60 years before him, before this story kicks off, around 60, 70 years before that. So Imam Ghazali's Wasit, Imam Shirazi's Muhaddab, and Imam Shirazi's Tanbih, they have studied these 3 books in a year. So Wasit and Basit, if any your listeners who are Shafi'i students of knowledge, or ulama even, know the multi-volume works. They are like the end of it all. This is like not a book you just pick up to study. But he's saying people actually go to Mogadishu to study those books, those 4 books. So 4 major, what Imam Nawawi calls the 5 pinnacle books in our madhab, Imam Nawawi calls it. So he wants to go and study that in Mogadishu in 1 year. Is that possible? That's what he's wondering. And that's what the anecdote of the biographical layers are telling us. Is that possible? Can such a thing, can such a feat be done? And so he says, I'm going to put that to the test and I want to go and study in Mogadishu. And what do you know? He comes to Mogadishu, he finds a scholar celebrated for actually teaching all 4 books. And he indeed studies with him in a year, indeed goes back in Yemen saying like, I've completed that task. And this is one of those phenomenal stories that you have. And that is just one, but one of the most phenomenal stories in that time period of Said Mogadishu that he lived.
And so that's a very fascinating insight that oftentimes, well, I've never heard it before actually, that not only was it a safe haven for scholars across the Muslim world in terms of strife, political strife, that they would seek safe shelter effectively across the ocean in Mogadishu, but also it was a seminary of knowledge, advanced knowledge. So the epitome of the Shafi'i fiqh would be taught in various volumes in 1 year. So that is actually the pull.
So close to the death of the author's books as well.
Which would imply that the teachers were actually not far off from the actual authors. The connection there was very, very closely knit, yes. So they're very connected to the world of knowledge and science across the Muslim world. Very fascinating. So then we hear of names such as Sa'id of Mogadishu, who is one of many. We know that he spent approximately 24 years in Mecca, Medina studying at a very high level, a very, very high level. But why do we not hear much more about the scholarly or this academic history of Mogadishu and the exports of Mogadishu? As you said, the only name I know of is Sa'id of Mogadishu. But as you explained to me, there were many others of his caliber, but potentially higher. What could be the reason for that?
The reason is no interest. That's one main reason, I would say. Because scholarly interest has to be there, because scholarly interest and scholarly efforts bring things out to the mainstream world. So once things are read in books that are easily accessible, once things are studied, once interest is engaged with, then people talk about it more and more and more. But when things are in the obscure, when they are in the manuscripts, when you have to rely on secondary sources in terms of to deduce evidences and stuff, they stay obscure. They stay sort of dedicated to footnotes in history. And that's one of the main reasons, I would say. But the other also is that, unfortunately, and as is in the case with most of Africa, not only the Horn of Africa, but most of the Africa, Islam is seen as a byproduct. It's not seen as a indigenous thing. It's seen things that are always brought in forcefully, conquest, forced, just like much of Christianity through European imperialism has been going on. It's been, like this. Obviously there's early Christianity with Ethiopians. Nobody's denying that, especially with the Berbers as well, who were early Christians as well. Those did exist. But for the massive amount of data that we have in terms of how Christianity spread in the Horn, it came with the European imperialism, with the European colonialism. However, that is not the case with Islam. So therefore, since that's not the case with Islam, portray Islam like that. So let's portray Islam with that. And because, it's slavery, it's forced, people have been conquered, people have, those type of narratives becomes the most prevalent of knowledge. And so therefore, you don't see people like Sa'id of Mogadishu. You don't see people like 𝙆𝙘𝙗, who is the scholar who was teaching that book we were just talking about with Imam Ghazali. You don't see those people. You don't see Abu Bakr ibn Jibril. Abu Bakr ibn Jibril, subhanAllah, is one of the scholars who actually was an expert in Shafi'i madhab, who left the Horn of Africa and built base in Yemen and taught most of the scholars that would live at his time period all the fiqh, all the books in the Shafi'i madhab. He was the head of the most prestigious universities that were based in Yemen. He was the head of it. So he kept moving from one university to another university because leaders wanted him to actually engage in that knowledge, teach people in that knowledge. He became the Chief Justice in several leadership, and eventually he just wanted to walk out of that because he didn't want the Chief Justice post anymore. And one of the reasons tells us he didn't want the Chief Justice anymore because, it wasn't paying enough, because he had people that he was sending money back home to, because he was paying for his family back home, it's all these type of things. And so it's because, the economy of Yemen was dwindling down at the time. So he couldn't afford the salary that he had. It wasn't really affordable for his family. And so anecdotes like this and stories like this exist constantly. Like 𝘆𝙑𝙘𝙍 of Mogadishu, who is the leader of Maldives when Ibn Battuta goes to the Maldives. But he is not only a leader, but he's the sheikh, the imam.
Sorry, so he was the leader that Ibn Battuta encounters in the Maldives was a Somali.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Oh,
yeah. No, there is a by the name of 𝘆𝙑𝙘𝙍. Is in the Rihla of Ibn Battuta. He mentions that when he comes to the Maldives, because he stays significantly long period in the Maldives. There's a funny story that he tells in his time in the Maldives, which again relates to how they embraced Islam through al-Barbari. I don't know whether you know the account of how the Maldives came to Islam. There's a scholar by the name of Abu al-Barakat, he says, Abu al-Barakat al-Barbari, right? He says he came, he taught people Islam, and he tells the story and how he brought Islam to the people because of the people had this superstition of jinn. You know, they used to sacrifice a young girl on a pole or something like that. And so when that happened, constantly kept happening, this alim comes and he said, you know, if I made sure that that demon went away, what would you say about Islam and the idea of that? And they would say, we would accept your religion in wholesale, you know? And then he so goes to the pole that they usually sacrifice the young girl to. And then he kept reading Quran, they say. He kept reading Quran because they kept hearing the first night, no demon came and the girl was not sacrificed. The second night, nothing happened. The third night, nothing happened. And by then, that's how the island or massive part of the island embraced Islam because of his efforts. So the Abu Barakat al-Barbari, many historians said he is a Berber of North Africa, right? Now, other prominent scholars argue, no, that's not possible because the Berber that they are talking about here is Berbera, not the other side. And so, yeah, so not the Berbers, but actually of Berbera. So therefore, al-Barbari relates to the Somalis. And Abu Barakat here means Barkhadle. Somalis, there is a contemporaneous scholar by the name of Sheikh Yusuf al-Kownain, also known as Abu al-Barakat, or Sheikh, the Sheikh with the Baraka. So this alim or this teacher, who was expert in the Quranic studies, and this is still today, we have the way that we do hifd in Quran. The kids memorize the Quran, comes through his model of teaching the Quran. And so they say, because this alim was known to have traveled to Iraq and a lot of places, studied there and spread there, it must have been him who was at the Maldives. And this is what one of the things that the scholar Richard Bulliet, who is the historian and expert in a lot of early spread of Iran, Islam in Iran, modern day Iran and everything. He wrote a lot of phenomenal works. One of the arguments he makes is, he says, Abu Barakat can never be anybody else except a Somali from Berbera, because otherwise even Ibn Battuta would have said a man that came from a background, because he's a Berber himself. So he would have recognized that effort. So yeah, this is the spread of Islam through Red Sea, as well as the Indian Ocean, and establishment of scholarship and institutions, and the learning was very, very deep, very extensive. And this is some of the things I specifically usually focus on, the effort of the Islamic seminaries and the ulama.
So from that very enlightening kind of discourse, you've given us a lot to think about, because we're seeing not only a reception in Mogadishu, whereby peace is sought, so from scholars coming abroad, as far as Shiraz, which is in the Persian kind of mainland, seeking shelter and peace, but also an external mission. So people leaving Mogadishu or regions within that part of the world and going into Yemen, which is known as a traditional home for the early Muslim community as well, but across even as far as the Maldives, spreading the deen. So that's actually very interesting, because I never saw it that way. You know, the mission from Somalia or from the Horn of Africa into the other parts of the world with very capable, very highly placed individuals. These were not just ordinary teachers. They were 𝘾𝙤𝙤𝙬𝙤, people who are considered, you could almost say, masters of their disciplines, spreading the word across. And as you mentioned earlier on in discussion, They were not slaves who were brought into Arabia and suddenly became, because of their, no, these people came with knowledge. They came as free people. They came as people who were recognized and actually welcomed by the aristocracy and trusted, yes. And 𝗏 of Mogadishu being one example of many. One of many, yes.
And that trust element is really important, brother, that you're highlighting. And the emphasis of their scholarship carrying that what we today would call a CV, what we today would call a de facto reference letter, because their scholarship and their study, their learning, their piousness and their reputation, it sort of precedes them because of the quality of learning, the quality of individual that they are. And wherever they ended up inheriting the qualities and the responsibilities that came with that. And so one of those responsibilities is the diplomatic missions that they then went on. And this is somewhere where I want to say before we jump to 𝗏 of Mogadishu. The diplomatic aspects, and this is something that our teacher Sheikh Mohammed Hussein Ma'alim writes in one of his books called 𝗲𝗏𝗏 بين القرن الإفريقي والعالم الخارجي. The interaction, the relationship, the diplomatic contacts that the Horn of Africa had with the outside world came and was facilitated many times through the scholars, through the ulama. And now you see that works that are dedicated, like what we mentioned earlier on, Ibn Fadlallah al-Umari, who was a Syrian scholar, who was later based in Cairo, who was the chancery, who was the writer and basically the right-hand man who wrote everything and copied the details, the text of the Mamluk Sultan, the most powerful man alive at the time, because the Mamluk Sultanate was the most powerful dynasty on the face of the earth around the 13th century CE, till say, because that's also not really talked about, that it's really underplayed the role that the Mamluk dynasty has played in spreading Islam and advancing Islam. But coming back to that, he was the chancery, Ibn Fadl al-Umari was the chancery for that. And now the material that he writes in that book, we talked about 16, 17 volumes today, on where he talks about the Ard al-Habasha and the kingdoms, the information that he gets comes through the mouth of the ulama who actually left Zayla. They left these dynasties, they left Bali, they left Ifat, they left Aden, they left all these dynasties, and they traveled to the court of the Mamluk Sultan at the time, and they are sort of carrying information. They're carrying pouches of, what is today would be known as diplomatic pouches, from the leaders that they came from, saying, listen, we're having a problem with the Christian empire that's next door, that's, using force, supremacy, that they're threatening things, they're threatening Hijaz, they're threatening Mecca and Medina, they're threatening the Suez Canal, the Nile and everything else. So all of these things are happening, and you guys are stone throw, you're in Cairo. You need to do something about this, you need to help us, assist us in terms of armaments, in armies and stuff. And who are carrying these letters? The ulama. Nobody else is carrying. So Ibn Fadlallah mentions that the faqih and the people that were with him, the ulama that were with him, Abdullah al-Ẓayl'i, he calls him, Abdullah al-Ẓayl'i, and the people that were with him gave me this information from their mouth, that this is happening in their dynasties, in their kingdoms, and this is the problem. They sell this, they buy this, and they came with the letters from the emirs. So we see constantly this happening throughout Islamic history.
So there must have been plenty of scholars in that case to be able to carry this message across the Muslim world. And as you mentioned, the Mamluk, in fact, when the Portuguese were about to raid Jeddah and working their way inland to Mecca, because they were actually intending to conquer Mecca, it was a combination of the Mamluk and the Somali, I think there was a Somali sultanate at the time, that worked together to repel this Portuguese incursion and literally save the day, because otherwise it would be a Portuguese colony, Exactly,
talks
yes.
about that. Much of their push in terms of the Horn of Africa, which is modern day Swahili coast, like Zanzibar, the modern day Kenyan area stuff, when they came and they put their forts up in Mombasa, in what is today the island of Lamu, and all these places, when they were coming there to conquer all these kingdoms, it is the indigenous people that live there, the Muslims, in collaboration with other Muslims that also live there, that are not ethnically the same, they don't speak the same language and everything else, but they share this common passport of La ilaha illallah. So they were helping each other push, and so you have these stories that actually happened throughout early periods of Vasco da Gama, his son Tristan, when he came to the Horn of Africa in the aid of the Amharic Empire, who eventually loses his life down the process. Then the Portuguese started calling he was a wali, he was a saint, and wherever his blood spilled, a fountain popped up. They called the fountain of youth. So anybody that drank from there and swam in it or whatever, they never aged or something. Myths like this popped up, just to say that this guy was a martyr of excellent quality. And at the end of the day, he just died because he was in the wrong war, aiding the wrong side of two local indigenous people who were, fighting for, future economies and other things,
Brilliant. I mean, it's been an enlightening encounter as always. We've learned so much, and I hope, inshallah, we have more opportunity to learn from you and to draw from your well of knowledge. Can you tell us a bit more about your projects and where somebody looking into this field of study, which is a very, 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 very narrow field of study, where should they begin? How could they follow your projects, your programs?
At the moment, in between places. I'm never getting my act together by the way it looks, but Alhamdulillah, I've been doing these type of podcast things, which is filmed and edited. I haven't launched it properly. I've put up the first episodes of early Islam in the Horn of Africa, which you can find on 𝘾𝙗cast. So 𝘾 is spelled as LOH cast, and I think you'll find it later on, inshallah, here written. So 𝘾𝙗cast is one of those places I'm going to be doing and putting up a lot of my material, which is auditory and visual, inshallah, as a proper podcast, but also through 𝘾 Press, which is a small publication house which I founded over a decade ago, mainly publishing other people's books. Inshallah, I'll be launching translation series of these books that we've quoted so far, that I've been working on for a number of years now. They've been piling up, the books have been piling up, but they've been also getting thicker and thicker because of the details I'm adding and things that I'm adjusting and stuff as we learn more and more and more day in, day out. So inshallah, those series of books will be coming out, and I keep saying this date or that date, but now I'm not going to say that anymore because I want to do it, inshallah. So 𝘾 Press is a place to look at. And obviously my personal socials. So if somebody looks me up as Muhammad Abdullah Artan, I think you can find me on Facebook and Instagram. Usually on Facebook, where I put all my historical thinking out there, and my pondering gets sort of engaged there. But yeah, a lot of material that relates to the history of the Horn of Africa is unstudied or dug out yet, and that's what I'm trying to do, sort of dig it out, bring it out, to make it a more mainstream, so that scholars in the future, or would-be scholars, can engage with it, but also maybe build on it, because it's very minimal. The things that I'm doing is very basic, very minimal, and I'm not a scholar of history. I'm more like somebody who's self-taught, who went with people, engaged with scholars and these type of things, and learns from people and researches. Yeah.
Barakallahu feekum. Well, we definitely appreciate all of the work you've put in over the years, and I think it does shift perspectives in many, many different ways. Just to actually see the authentic representation of such a history that is organically conveyed. It's not easy to kind of gather tidbits of information here and then, correlate the different perspectives, but I think the way you present it makes it very easy for us to grasp the meaning, also the scope of what you're conveying. So I hope, inshallah, we have further opportunity to, again, to engage you on this sort of discussion.